This film stands in stark stylistic contrast to earlier works of Soviet war cinema. Highly stylized action films focused on the lionization of Russian statesmen and war heroes. These films are an example of socialist realism, a genre which foregrounded Soviet ideology, using cinema as a didactic tool for ideological propagation. Films in this style often spoke to the experiences of Russians on the front line of the war effort. Many of these works, such as 1943's She Defends Her Motherland by Friedrich Ermler, consist in a subgenre of heroine films, which follow the experiences of women whose families have been lost and who become fierce partisan fighters by way of revenge. Towards the end of World War II, Joseph Stalin began to be a main focus of socialist realist war cinema, with films often portraying him as single-handedly winning the war. After Stalin's death, leader Nikita Khrushchev began a process of political reforms called the Thaw. Film scholar Denise J. Youngblood describes the shift away from socialist realism in reaction to this change. After Stalin's death, we see something interesting occur. As a result of Khrushchev's encouragement to artists, signified by the publication of Ilya Ehrenburg's novel The Thaw, some prominent Soviet filmmakers stubbornly refused to use war material in the same old way. Rather than making stylized epics in socialist realist fashion, a daring few fomented a quiet revolution, both in the style and content of the war film. They reconfigured the war film, amazingly enough, as a kind of camera drama, jettisoning traditions of the socialist realist epic. This process was not unique to film, but nowhere else in the cultural sphere was it so obvious or so successful. Come and See is a prime example of this shift in genre. Instead of a focus on ideology, collective fighting spirit, and a victorious filmic tone, Come and See foregrounds the experience of war as a trauma one is patient to, the hell of overwhelming confusion and violence, the evils of fascism and its distortion of humanity. To this end, director Klimov states in an interview, historical accuracy was of the utmost importance. Quote, "My film, Come and See, was shot only on Belarusian soil. The events with the people, the peasants, actually happened as shown in the film. Come and See doesn't have any professional actors. Even the language spoken in the film is Belarusian. What was important was that all the events depicted in the film really did happen in Belarus." In the same interview, Klimov speaks to the function of his film as a commentary on the experience of war and victimization under fascism. To come right to the point, Come and See is both an anti-fascist film and an anti-war film. Another very important purpose in the making of that film was to talk about a human being. What is a human all about? What are the limitations of a human? As Dostoevsky once wrote, a human being is a beast in you that you can face, and it faces you. Someone under certain circumstances can discover in himself some horrible things, that he as a human being can fall so low. That is what I tried to depict in Come and See. And that's why we set out to show in the film a human being near his limits, and sometimes even beyond his limits, to show just what a human is. In such a task, these very questions are the most important in the world of art. Come and See would prove to be Klimov's final film, and he himself took an active role in the revitalization of Soviet cinema while working for Goskino, the USSR State Committee for Cinematography. Having produced his magnum opus, Klimov worked to deshelve films previously considered to be too controversial. He began his career as a subversive director whose films received little distribution for their surreal and sometimes almost iconoclastic portrayal of Soviet life and history. But by the end of his life, he was widely considered as one of the most influential directors in global cinema. While the political and generic divergences of Come and See provide useful context for understanding the film's place in history, this context does little to prepare one for actually watching it. I want to take a moment to describe my experience of the film and how my prior encounters of war cinema left me unprepared for the emotional straits Come and See puts the viewer through. Modern war cinema, while stylistically and ideologically diverging in many ways from socialist realism, seems to serve similar propagandic goals. American war films, at least those which purport to be based in history, are never set on American soil. They nearly always follow a small group, or better yet, an individual, as they intrepidly brave enemy lines in order to carry out their objective. Stars of these types of films are overwhelmingly male and embody the values of traditional masculinity, specifically as carriers out of violence. These films, apart from a few notable exceptions, seem to emerge from the American consciousness as celebrations of victory, reinforcements of the notion of America as the world's top dog. That war is hell is treated less as a stylistic truth than a kind of pastiche of struggle, one which is quickly dispensed with as the viewer exits the cinema and enters a world rife with sensuous commercialism. Come and See does not and cannot leave the viewer's consciousness. Our heroic protagonist is a terrified child who doesn't hurt a single person. I can recall almost the entire film when I think of the times I've watched it, and I was unable to bring myself to the full experience of the film more than once throughout my research for this presentation. It is not fun to watch. Film critic Roger Ebert describes Come and See as one of the most devastating films ever about anything, and in it, the survivors must envy the dead. Similarly, the viewer of this film comes away from it with something both very near to and very far away from regret, and in some ways can be said to envy those who have not yet seen it. Every aspect of the film creates the feeling of powerless subjection. Even moments of strained joy, such as Fliora and Glasha's journey through the forest, retain the feeling of a hallucinogenic experience gone horribly wrong. The viewer is consistently confronted by the camera. The direct gaze into the camera, so prevalent in this film, creates an on-screen space that can never become an off-screen space. Or rather, an off-screen space that can never become an on-screen space. Klimov is not creating an unreflexive realist environment, but a psychological environment, Ben Smith writes. This dualism of subject and film, so carefully attended to in its composition, is almost cruelly leveraged in the final act, an unblinking and relentless sequence which cannot be accurately described in words. This film serves not to engender in the viewer a sense of victory, cohesion, or faith in humanity. One can only lament the past and what is lost in it. In the next part of this presentation, we'll be looking at how the film creates a sense of eventality for the viewer, how it reacts to events in history, and what it says about the possibility of event in the real world.